creation. So that might be something like this, where perhaps you're an influencer and you're going to demonstrate a product, for podcasts, YouTube videos, and other online types of clips. And the idea here is just to give you some ideas, some different concepts that you can use to create some very simple lighting setups that will really enhance the way your videos look. So this might be a fairly typical setup or scenario. We have an influencer who is going to talk about some products, and it's a fairly small space. And as you can see, the lights that are already in this space are causing all sorts of problems. The color temperature isn't very nice. We have very little control over those lights. They're creating little pools and spots of lights. It's not very nice. And these lights flicker, which is very common now with a lot of lower cost domestic and industrial lighting. An important consideration for this is going to be the products. We're going to need to see those products, but at the same time, the influencer wants to look good. So a really easy way to light something like this is to use a panel light mounted high above the scene, high above the set in front, putting a lot of light straight into the set. So let's have a look at how that might look. So to start off with, I've used a Pavo Slim 120C panel light, and I've attached this to a spigot on the ceiling here. And this has eliminated our problems with flicker, poor color temperature, and it's a much higher quality light. You could also use a light stand, it doesn't have to be on a spigot. And this now gives us a nice flat light directly into the face of the influencer, and it allows you to see the products on the desk. But although this isn't an unreasonable light, it's not particularly attractive, it's not actually that interesting. So now I've put the light on a stand, still the panel light, and instead of having it straight on, I'm going to move the light around to the side a little bit, because this now adds more modelling onto the influencer's face, a bit of light and dark, light and shadow, and immediately it starts to look more three-dimensional and a bit more interesting. So the next thing I'm going to do is to balance out this light a little bit by adding a fill light, and for that I'm going to use a tube light, but you could use another soft light in a softbox. Lots of options as to what light you could use. But what I'm doing is basically balancing out those shadows a little bit, and also this light is putting a bit more light onto the objects or the products that the influencer is going to show, so that the audience at home can see them a bit better. So this is starting to look much nicer now. We can see the product, we can see the influencer's face. Those are the two most important things. But the one thing that's still a bit boring, a bit dull in this shot is this back wall. Now you could build a nicer set, perhaps add some bookshelves or some pictures on the wall. But if you do just have a plain wall, we can use light to make it more interesting. So what I'm going to do to start off with as an idea is use another of these tube lights. And we could position the tube lights actually in the shot, in the background perhaps, also creates a nice backlight. But what I want to do with this is I'm just going to put it on a little box behind the chair, just to create a wash on the wall. And it just breaks up that background, adds a bit of colour, makes it look much more interesting. So we have our nice wash on the wall, which is great and certainly a very valid way of creating some interest on that otherwise plain wall. But the other thing we can do is to use a projector lens. And in this case, I've got a Forza 60C with a Nanlite projector lens, and within that is a gobo. And we can use this to create interesting light patterns on walls and other surfaces. And we have the ability to control it, to focus it, defocus it, to create something really interesting on that back wall. So this is now looking quite attractive. But if you think about how we light when we use three-point lighting, we will normally have a key light, and then we have a fill light, but we also very often have a backlight to separate the foreground from the background. We only actually have about ½ a meter between the wall and our influencer here. And I think by adding a backlight, we can actually make that distance look a bit further, add a bit more modeling, a bit more separation, and it should also backlight the products a little bit to make them a little bit more interesting. So let's introduce a backlight. And this backlight I have on a stand with an arm so that we don't have a problem with the stand in the middle of the shot. So let's just bring this into position. And don't forget, if you're doing this, to make sure that you have adequate sandbags or counterweights for the light that you're using. And the aim of the light also affects where the sheen is on the table, which is quite nice. And I can just bring this backlight in. It separates the foreground from the background, adds that lovely sheen on the desk, and really completes this shot. So I've already shown how you can use the Nanlite Forza 60C with a projector attachment, or other lights with a projector attachment with a gobo to project patterns on the wall. But projector lenses aren't something that everybody has. And you can in fact create something very similar with any COB light. So this is a Nanlite FC120B with a reflector on it. It works best with a reflector rather than a Fresnel lens. We simply turn the light on and then we find something to shine through that beam of light to create interesting patterns. We all know we can create shadows with our hands. So if we find something with a pattern on it, such as this, and we put it in front of the light, we can create all sorts of interesting patterns on the wall. Do be careful with the spacing between your pattern and the light, because it could get hot, especially if you're using a very high powered light. But with LED lights, that tends to be less of a problem than it used to be. So it's about using your imagination. Now, something else that you can use is this material here, which is kind of like very thick kitchen foil or kitchen wrap, aluminium foil, much thicker. It's painted black and it's called black wrap. And you can use a knife or your finger or a pen and you can cut holes in this material very easily, then support it in front of your light and you can create your own patterns. Really, it's down to your imagination that you can then project onto the wall to create those interesting textures in the background. So this is a different scenario. This could be a podcast or a two-person interview, fairly relaxed environment. We're going to be having a chat together. And what I've done initially is I've put in a single panel light in front of the two of us. Now the problem when you do this is it's almost certainly going to cast shadows directly behind us on the wall behind, which are unattractive. And even if I lit that wall, those shadows would still be there and they would be distracting. Now, if you look at most television studios, what you'll find is they normally have a key light for each presenter, and it's angled so that the shadows don't fall directly behind them. So let's bring in another panel light, light both of us individually, and see what that does. So now I've added that second panel light. And the lights are angled so that this light that's in front of me is actually lighting our model Liz here and putting the light on her, and as a result her shadow is now off out of the frame over to the side. The light that's in front of Liz is lighting me, so my shadow is also now predominantly out of the frame. And the fact that the lights are in front of us means that we have fewer shadows, so it's a little bit more flattering. So the shot's getting there, but it's still an uninteresting shot. And that's largely because this wall behind us is very stark and very bare. So what I'm going to do now is add a color wash to that wall. So as you can see, I've now added a wash on the wall behind me, and I've chosen a nice warm orange color. Now this wash is being created simply by placing a tube light on the floor down here behind us. Very simple, very easy to do. You could use an uplighter type light. You could use a small COB light hidden behind the chairs to create that backlight. But a tube is very simple and a very easy way to do this. Now, one of the nice things about these Nanlite Pavo tube lights is you can control them with a very simple remote control. So I'm going to change the color of this light, and in the lighting world we refer to color as the hue. So I'm going to change the color of the light to something much cooler, and you'll see that how changing to a bluer light really quite dramatically changes the whole feel of this shot. And you might use this cooler light for something like a corporate interview or something more serious. So that's our wash, our foreground light. And if we think now about 3-point lighting again, the one extra light that we could add is perhaps a backlight to separate us from the background again. And for that, I'm going to use another tube light on a stand positioned above us. So let's see how that looks. So I've added that backlight, a tube light suspended above us. And as you can see, it adds this sort of glow around us, which is why it's often called a rim light or a hair light. And it really does complete this shot. It separates us from that background with the color wash. So to summarize, in the foreground, have 2 panel lights and they are crossing so that the one over there is on me and the one over here is on Liz over here. We call that cross keying. Then we have the wash on the wall behind from a tube light on the floor, but it could be a different type of fixture. And then a backlight coming from this tube light up here. It's a very simple setup. It doesn't require a lot of space and it works really well. So lighting sometimes is about making use of the light that you've got. So in this scenario here, which might be a YouTube influencer presenting to camera, we have these very large windows, and these are giving us a really nice wraparound light coming from the side. Arguably, you might call this key light, but what it does give us, whatever you call it, is this really nice wraparound light, and it gives us this nice modeling which creates the 3D effect across the face. But our model is too dark, so we're going to have to fill this with a fill light. And you can see that I've already set this up. I'm using a COB light, a cob light, with a dome so that we have a nice, soft, flattering fill light. So let's turn the fill light on. And now we're filling in those shadows gently with a softer light, and it's complementing this light coming through the windows. So one of the things we have to be careful of when we do this is matching the color temperature of the fill light with the light that's coming through the windows, so we don't have strange skin tones going from left to right across the face. So now looking at this shot, again we have a problem with this uninteresting wall in the background. And one of the things we can do instead of lighting the wall is to actually make the wall darker. Again, we're introducing contrast between the foreground and the background to help us separate the foreground from background. And I'm going to use something called a flag. Now basically a flag is a device that you use to cut off light. This is a professional black flag, but you could use anything, a piece of black plastic, a black cloth, anything that you have to hand, perhaps a pop-up black flag. And all I'm going to do is use this to cut off the light so less light is falling on the back wall to make it darker. So now we've added the flag, we've cut off the light to the wall, and I actually think this shot already looks quite nice. We have that lovely rim light, side light coming through the window, plus a single light fixture, a very simple light setup. But I think we could actually go a little bit further with this. We do have a COB light. I got a Forza 60C with a projector lens on it, and I'm going to put a gobo in that represents the Venetian blinds to mimic light coming from the green of the garden onto the wall behind us to create some color interest in the background. So now we have two lights. We have the projector light creating this pleasing pattern on the wall representing the light coming through the blinds, and we have our fill light plus of course the light coming through from the window. Now we could add another light, which is a backlight or hair light, to create some separation from the background. Of course, each one of these lights is optional. You don't always have to use 3 lights, but for this I'm going to introduce a very small tube light. This is a little Pavo Tube 6, and turn this on. We can just put this on a little stand here just to add some separation between the foreground and background.